Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie, and this is the Majori on Bowie YouTube channel, where I have a new interview every week that always has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, visit the blog www.majorionbowie.com, where I have new content every single day that almost always has something to do with David Bowie. And as long as you're here, please hit like and subscribe. So today I am very excited, very pleased to have as a returning guest my friend Keanan Duffty. Keanan has previously appeared on the show where we largely talked about his work as a fashion designer and the project that he did in 2007 with David Bowie that produced a line of clothing that was sold at Target, including this T-shirt, which I bought at the time.
Yay.
Um, but Keenan is, he's so much more than a fashion designer. He is an educator, he is an author, he is a musician. And I really wanted to talk to him about his central musical project, Slinky Vagabond, and we'll come back to the name of that. So I'm really delighted that Keenan has agreed to come back to the show today. The last time we met, it was in person in New York City. This time I am in a fictional nightclub. Um, it's the kind of place I think Slinky Vagabond would play. Keenan, welcome back. Thank you for joining me.
John, thank you so much for having me back. What a great project you have as well with Majori on Bowie. It's so fantastic, and you have very dedicated followers too. So it's really wonderful. There's a great Bowie community out there that you're delivering all of this great content to. So thank you for inviting me back again. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Keenan. So there's so much I want to talk to you about, and well, why don't we start with this? There is an occasion for us talking about Slinky Vagabond today, and it's as we're recording, the pending release of a new album. Um,
Yeah.
so so what is that? What is it called? So I should say, and you can see in Keenan's background, that Slinky Vagabond has released two previous albums, King Boy Vandals and the Eternal Return. And So what's the new album? What is it? What is the new
Actually,
album called?
behind me, there's a couple of pieces of artwork which are for the new record. Everything's in mirror, so I'm not quite sure what I'm pointing at. And it's an album of a couple of some new tracks, several new tracks actually, and then several tracks that have previously been released off of our last two records, but they're acoustic versions of them. We stripped them right down. It's mostly just guitar, acoustic guitars and voices. Fabio and I are partners in Slinky Vagabond. We do all the songwriting together. We conceptualize everything together. We've been, friends, good friends for coming up to a decade now. And we thought this was just a great sort of intermediary. We're actually working on a new record, which we hope to have out in 2027 with a full band. But the idea with the new acoustic record is we would reinterpret some of our previously recorded songs, do a couple of new ones, and do some really significant covers, and also include on the redos some of the musicians that we previously worked with, several of whom had worked with David over, in Mike Garson's case, for most of David's career, and Ava
Yeah.
Cherry too, So there are some long-term Bowie alumni. There's a Bowie cover on there. There's a cover of Ziggy Stardust. And yeah, we really enjoyed doing this. We thought it was kind of a timely thing. And we wanted to strip it down to just really the voice and the guitar, because that's Fabio and I. Fabio is also a great singer. So he's singing on some of the tracks as well. He sings a lot of the backing vocals. But he's a great guitar player, great producer. And yeah, we thought this was a good moment for it.
Yeah. Keenan was good enough to share the tracks with me, and it sounds terrific. And the sound to me. Keenan, I have to admit something. I know a little bit about David Bowie. I am not an expert on music, and so I'm going to talk about what the music sounds like to me in ways that somebody who does would probably scoff at. But I when I listen to new music, I often relate it to what does it sound like, and I don't mean in a way that imitates other sounds, but the Bowie influence is very obvious,
Hmm.
and I hear a little, an influence from the New Romantic period and a little Roxy Music and a little Oasis.
Yeah.
And but beyond the sound, one of the things I like about the songs is your wordplay. There are some words and phrases like the name of the band itself that are associated with Bowie, but the name of the album, we haven't said it yet. So
Right.
what is the name of the album? And I'm interested in how you're going to pronounce it.
Yeah, so well, being a bit of a sick puppy myself, I like wordplay and I kind of like irreverence. And so the album's called Acoustic New Romantic. And the reason why it's called that is because there actually is a benign tumor that's a slow growing tumor that kind of uh, grows between the inner ear, the nerve of the ear, and the brain. And it kind of causes hearing loss, and it's called acoustic neuroma.
Yeah.
So I kind of heard this phrase and I thought, how brilliant, because that incorporates several ideas that are from this record. One of which we do a cover of a song called "To Cut a Long Story Short," which was Spandau Ballet's first ever single, and we do a kind of acoustic, almost like a. To me, it sounds a bit like the Gypsy Kings. Actually, it's kind of got this sort of like slightly gypsy guitar groove to it. Um, and so that's one of the original New Romantic tracks with Fade to Grey from Visage and with, Duran Duran's Planet Earth. They
Yeah.
were some of the first singles of the New Romantic era. And really, New Romantics are where that's where I kind of came of age. I mean, I came up through the punk thing, but I was going to all the shows and saw the Clash, Generation X, Susie and the Banshees, all of those artists.
When
But
you were 8, right?
well, no, yeah, I wish I was eight. I was 14 in 1978, so that was kind
Yeah.
of a perfect time to like come of age in the punk era. But then New Romantics kind of wove back in all of the great things that I loved about glam rock, about some of the artists that you mentioned, like Roxy Music, and it kind of brought those back into the center stage. And of course, with David's Scary Monsters, that was really, I think, this sort of pivotal moment for the New Romantics because David was very smart. He didn't jump into that scene and kind of leave behind everything else that he'd ever done. He took all of the elements of rock, art rock, the kind of experimental stuff with him. So that record still stands up today, Scary Monsters, I think, because of the
Yeah.
input of a great band, of guest artists like Robert Fripp, even of Pete Townsend, who's playing on one of the songs. So David was kind of able to bring the rock element back in, and he does a cover of great cover of a television song too. So he's not completely ditching everything that came before. He's sort of weaving it back in, and I loved that record, and I loved the New Romantic movement because it allowed us to dress up again. So we wanted to sort of touch on that a little bit. And that was the first track that actually Fabio and I recorded together. We did that in, I think it was 2018. So it's coming up to, 8, 9 years ago now. And it was a kind of an experimental thing. Because at the time, Spandau Ballet were looking for a new singer, and I kind of thought, oh, I'm going to send this to Gary and Gary Kemp, and maybe he'll let me have a go at auditioning for them. That didn't happen, but
It didn't
we got
happen.
we got a tune. I met up with Gary, but I
Yeah.
think that they'd already had someone in mind. But yeah, so that was Fabio and I's first little project together, and so we dug it out and dusted it off for this record.
So you didn't get to become the lead singer of Spandau Ballet, but you have through Slinky Vagabond and some of your other pursuits and have played with some of our David Bowie musical heroes.
Yeah.
And why don't you tell us a little bit about the history, the idea behind Slinky Vagabond? And I think a lot of people watching this will recognize the term, but where does that come from? And who are some of the other bands and musicians you've either played with or have actually contributed to the project directly?
Yeah, so Slinky Vagabond comes from Young Americans, and it's part of a line in Young Americans. I sort of adopted that in the 90s when I moved to the US. I was setting up a fashion label and I needed a name for it. And I really love that name. So I kind of plucked that name. And I didn't think David would mind. Um, and uh, so that became like a sort of nom de plume for me. And I launched my fashion label and I actually did a record in the 90s under the name Slinky Vagabond called I Am an Alien, which was about being an immigrant coming to America and finding your way in America. And it was again a play on words, the whole sort of like space alien thing, but the immigration idea, which is so central to everybody's daily experience of cultural life in this world now. And I thought it was just like really interesting. And so that kind of became the fashion label name, and then the name of the label segued into my name for various reasons, some of them legal reasons. But the name Slinky Vagabond was always around. And then in 2007, I met up with Earl Slick, and we decided we were going to work together on recording some songs that I'd posted on social media at the time. And I approached my friend Glenn Matlock, who's one of the founding Sex Pistols, and asked him if he would play bass on it, on the tracks that we were recording, and he agreed. And then also the late, our dear friend Clem Burke, the drummer from Blondie, agreed to play drums on it. So we went upstate in New York to a studio called the Clubhouse, and we did, I think, 5 songs in a couple of days, and they sounded great. We really coalesced as a band, and we decided let's do some shows. Glenn had an offer to support the New York Dolls at Irving Plaza in New York as a fundraiser for lymphoma research. It's the Joe Ramone annual fundraiser. And so he said, why don't we do that? And we needed a name. And I suggested, well, actually, I think it was Glenn who said, why don't you use Slinky Vagabond? You've been using that. Before, and you just use that. So we did. And that's kind of how that first incarnation of the band side of Slinky Vagabond started. And it was really very good fortune for me to be able to work with 3 people who are signature to the influences that I have in my creative life. So that first step.
Well, let me ask you this. You said you're friends with Glenn Matlock, but you approached Earl Slick. You've already mentioned that Ava Cherry appears on this album. Mike
Yeah.
Garson appears on 2 songs. David Torn. How do you do
Yeah.
that? How do you just call him up and say, "Hey, Mike Garson, I need a piano player." How does that work?
Yeah. In some cases, well, actually, so Ava and I performed at the Bowie convention in New York in 2003 that Dave Pilchingi put together, and so I at that venue,
2023.
2023. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I was at as we were backstage in the green room. I got chatting with Ava. We got along very well, and I said to her, "Why don't you come up again with me and do a song? We'll do a song together. We'll do Jean Genie." And she did, and we hit it off. We became very friendly and stayed in contact. And then when we were recording The Eternal Return, we had this one track called Lady Bump Discotheque
Yeah.
that I had, again, the magpie that I am. I saw this as a title on an old, very appropriate for your backdrop. It's an old discotheque in Italy, in Florence, in Milan, Italy, and it's called Lady Bump Discotheque from the 70s, obviously. And I thought that was a great term. So I had this song with that title, and it was really about my growing up in the north of England and going to these sort of like slightly seedy discos in the late 70s because there was nowhere else to go. And I thought that the evocativeness of it would really suit having Ava's voice on the record as well, because it's really a ballad. It's not a disco track at all. It's a slow number. And so I asked Ava, will you sing backup on it, for us? I actually asked her if she would sing a vocal on it, and she said, yeah, I'll sing backup. And so she did that, and that was great. In the case of Mike Garson, I approached Mike through his manager, who's actually also his son-in-law, and I just contacted him on social media and said, "Hey, Mike, I got these tracks. Can I send a few to you?" I sent him, I think, 4 or 5. And I said, if you can pick a couple, if you like any of them, if you can pick a couple, that would be great. He picked two. He asked me what I wanted. On one, I said I want a kind of dissonant, jazzy, Aladdin Sane style of playing, and he did pretty much verbatim that. And then on the other, I said I want it to be a kind of like John Lennon Imagine, a little bit more low key, and he did exactly that. So one was Anthem, which is the song which
Yeah.
has the kind of slow Lennonish thing, and the other we he did the at the end, he actually does the Aladdin saying diddle it.
Yes. Yep.
It's kind of
Yeah.
perfect. I mean, it's so on the nose, but we left it in because if anybody's going to do that, it's going to be Mike Garson, right? So that's kind of how that works. But over the years, it's either people that I've met and have some sort of relationship with, and I've always wanted to work with them. Midge Ure, we worked with on our previous album, Boy Vandals. Interviewed Midge when he came to San Francisco in, I think it was 2013, and he was doing a show there. And I interviewed him for a university YouTube channel. And we hit it off. There was the connection between him and Glenn, obviously with Rich Kids and so on. And his, being a founder member of Visage, which for me was really, a seminal kind of act from the New Romantic era. So when it came to recording two of the songs from King Boy Vandals, I asked Midge, would you be up for playing on a couple of songs? And he said, yeah, send me the files. I'll do them in my little home studio. And that was it. Again, it was like, what do you want? Want a kind of a Rich Kids sort of, new wave guitar. Do whatever you want, do what you feel. And I think that's the way we work with all musicians. That's the way Fabio and I work together, and it's the way we work with anybody who participates. It's kind of like, they bring what they do, and we just
Yeah.
leave them to it.
Yeah, that's amazing. You've mentioned a few songs, and I do want to talk about the songs. And why don't we turn to that then? So um, and again, I'm going to relate to the lyrics and some of the connections that I heard in listening to these songs to Bowie or others. But
Yeah,
I do want to stress to anybody that's watching it, these are all original songs. They sound great. There's a familiarity, but they're new. If you haven't happened to hear them already, you have not heard them before. So if I make references to connections, one of my question is how deliberate are they? So you mentioned, for instance, the anthem, where you said Mike Garson had the little Aladdin Sane-esque tail at the end of the song. Well, I noticed another Aladdin Sane connection, the use of the term bright young things, which is a
sure.
line from Aladdin Sane, which was taken from a novel that Bowie was referencing, a novel. Was that? I'm assuming that was deliberate. That could not have been
Yeah,
random.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's I think it's Evelyn War
Yes.
is where it comes from. The whole I mean, Aladdin Sane is about the between the wars thing.
Yeah.
Um, with so actually Ad Astra is the track that Mike does the Aladdin same bit at the end. Anthem is actually I was very fortunate to be invited to Kyiv in Ukraine in the fall of 2021 before Russia invaded, before Putin invaded. And I found this really vibrant scene there of young people doing really creative things. And that really inspired me. And that inspired me lyrically in a few places on our record, The Eternal Return. So the Bright Young Things reference is definitely Aladdin Sane, but it's also about Kyiv because
Mm,
that was a magical moment for me. And it was sort of lyrically and metaphorically and physically destroyed by the invasion, but
yeah.
there was a feeling of kind of like Berlin in the late 90s, early 2000s, where it was such a hive of activity. And young people doing very, very creative things with very little overhead. Every major city in the world now is expensive to live in. At the time, Kyiv felt like you could be a young person doing stuff there with abandon. And that did remind me of that whole sort of Berlin moment. And then also a throwback to the between the wars, the Weimar Republic
Yeah.
era as well. But yeah, I mean, I wear my references and my heart on my sleeve. Obviously, David is definitely one of those major influences, and always was from being a kid because of the abandon in which he threw himself into creative projects. He wasn't afraid to fail, and
Yeah.
he was also somebody who was very um, clear about referring to where his ideas came from. The
Yes.
changes
Yes.
is obviously the Who, My
Yeah.
Generation, like all of those things. He did that very deliberately. And so when I reference Bowie or others, it's always very deliberate. But I will say we are not, and we don't endeavor to be kind of a Bowie tribute band.
Right.
And I think we have a sound that definitely evokes certain periods of what David does, but nobody can ever come close to what David does.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that he was truly a genius, a one of a kind. And anyone who, whether it's a band like Suede or whether it's an 80s band like Japan, who definitely had the influences, whether it's somebody like ourselves, we all definitely have the influences. But I think, David stands alone in
Yeah.
really in what he does, and is so incredibly unique.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I totally get that. And I think one of the reasons that we're still talking about David Bowie is that he left a lot for us to work with, right? He left
Yeah,
us something to do, and
sure.
that he's inspired other musicians
Yeah,
while he himself acknowledged his own influences, right? I mean,
of course. Yeah, yeah.
I think he was talking about Little Richard until, the year he died, right? So, but it's part of a tradition, but it's also for me, it's part of the fun to find
Yeah, of
these
course. Yeah,
connections.
of course.
So we talk about Anthem, and you mentioned the other song that Mike Garson played on Ad Astra, which to me sounded like a kind of a tribute, not like it's a
Yeah,
Bowie song, but it sounds like it's about David Bowie. And
it is.
also,
Yeah.
so speak about that, and also where does the title of that song come from?
Yeah, so the title is I'm going to paraphrase a translation of To the Stars. It's lyrically, I do reference, The Man Who Saw Tomorrow. Definitely that's pointing to David's very visionary, forward-thinking worldview,
Yeah,
creative view, being unafraid. But there are also other references, the When Androids Cry, like the Philip K. Dick,
yes,
Blow My Tears, the policeman said, and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? I nearly said electric sleep. The Blade Runner. There's the sort of paraphrase of the very famous Tannhauser Gate quote from Rutger Hauer in the Blade Runner movie,
yeah, yeah,
which I actually did put on a t-shirt once as well. So all those references are there, and it definitely is about David and about his passing into eternity.
yeah,
And the title of our last record, The Eternal Return. Eternal Return's a kind of a Nietzsche philosophical idea that we're in a loop and everything we do happens again, which I sort of do subscribe to in a way, but I kind of believe it happens again, but slightly differently each time. I think humans tend to do things in patterns, and nature moves in patterns, and so on. So yeah, but lyrically, the ideas in Ad Astra are definitely, referencing David and his passing.
yeah,
Um, I think it's not mournful though. It's
right,
very positive in a way. So yeah, and it was great to get Mike on that record for that reason. We wanted
yeah,
to. I think lyrically, it's obviously about David, but we having Mike on there and having those little Aladdin Sane references, I think it's very poignant, at least to me.
yeah. The idea of return, I thought of that also when I was listening to. So I should say there are several of the songs on this album have something to do with space, right?
Yeah.
And another one is called Earthman Go Home, which I also thought of this idea of return. It's almost, again, it's where my mind goes, but it's almost like I almost thought of it as like Earthman Come Home, and and it's referring to Major Tom or even referring to Bowie, like come back.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was intentional, but that's where it's where it took my mind.
Yeah, it's so Earthman Go Home is actually from a science fiction pulp book title. I'm forgetting who the author is now, which is terrible. It's I just had a birthday yesterday, and obviously it's all catching up with me. But no, the idea is about that track. We're kind of, we're in this moment where there's all this space tourism and everybody's talking about going to Mars and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, how amazing would it be to go to another planet and meet the people that are there and for them to say, go home, you're not welcome here. You've ruined your home planet. Don't come here and try and ruin ours as well.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the idea behind it. That maybe we would be sort of unwelcome interlopers if we ever did discover life on other worlds. We would actually, in all of the science fiction movies, we portray aliens coming to Earth and sort of destroying us and being the enemy almost. But what if we're actually the aliens that go to another planet and, you know, uh, kind of become a threat to others, which
Right.
essentially could be the case. So that was really the idea behind it. But yeah, there are a lot of science fiction references, and I think that comes through in a lot of my writing, my creativity. It's part of an age demographic, I think. We're the generation in the UK at least that grew up with Doctor Who, the Quatermass
Hmm.
Experiment,
Yeah.
and then all those great dystopian Logan's Run, Soylent
Yeah.
Green,
Yeah.
Omega Man, Planet of the Apes, all of those dystopian movies from the 70s that in this moment appear to be sort of coming true. So
Yeah.
it's very lyrically, it really feels very poignant to me. It might not feel poignant to somebody who's like 20, but
Well, I think of science fiction as never actually about the overt thing that it's about, right? It's always science fiction is always
yeah,
analogous to the real
sure,
world.
sure.
And yeah, so I think that's how you're using it. And your inspirations were all everything you just mentioned was about the time of the author or the artist. It's not about the future.
Yeah, yeah. And that was a kind of an era where I think Bowie was so um um prolific
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
a lot of ideas that stuck, that became very influential in culture and that kind of played, he almost birthed the whole Blitzkid generation that went into the 80s and then took those more esoteric ideas that art rock performers from the 70s, like David, like Roxy Music, Brian Eno, and so on, and they took them into the mainstream in the 80s, but in more of a commercial way.
Right.
The whole sound of the whole drum sound of every record in the 80s comes from low, basically.
Yes. Yes.
And at least to my ears. So I think it was an idea where a lot of those science fiction concepts that David sort of folded into his work, they actually became very mainstream.
Yeah.
In the following decade and in decades to come.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned before Scary Monsters, which is my favorite album, and you categorized it as um, being of the New Romantic period. But I also think that he was taking elements of that movement and t taking it to a different level. And
Yeah,
I was thinking about the Ashes to Ashes video where he literally recruited Stephen Strange and others from the Blitz Club
yeah,
here in the video.
yeah,
But
yeah.
but it's really also like the end of David Bowie in the 70s, right? And he's sort of projecting
Yes, yeah.
what's going to come. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was also parodying it too. He was not
Sure.
kind of
Yeah.
jumping fully into the swimming pool of New Romantics. He was sort of parodying it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how with the Blitz, there was just this amazing, there have actually been several exhibitions in London over the past couple of years. There was a recent one at the Design Museum, which was the kind of Blitz era. And you look at how many people from that small nightclub went on to achieve really great things. I mean, Sade is just about to be, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. She was a Blitz kid. Michelle Clapton designed most of the costumes for Game of Thrones. And if you
Yeah.
look carefully at Game of Thrones, you can really see all the Blitz influence in there. So, one of the biggest TV series of all time. So
Yeah.
these moments, they sort of came from that pebble being thrown into the pond. And the pebble, in many cases, was David, was Roxy Music, was a lot of those artists that were, even bands from Japan like Yellow Magic Orchestra and artists from Germany like Kraftwerk, which David really championed. They were very much part of that sort of nascent moment for the Blitz, what became known as the Blitz Kids or New
Yeah.
Romantics or whatever.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of played out. Those ripples really spread out over time.
Yeah, we talked about that a little the last time about how influences get sort of absorbed into culture and then
Yeah,
they reappear without necessarily, you know, the 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 wearer of the fashion does not necessarily know where it originated from.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll give you another example. The designer of the Acoustic New Romantic record sleeve. He also designed our Eternal Return cover. Is a
Hmm.
guy called Kevin Grady. He's an amazing creative art director. He's the founder of Lemon Magazine, Gum Magazine, and his current magazine is called Wednesday, and it's kind of a luxury gothic publication. It's into its second issue. He has, folks like Norman Reedus from Walking Dead, who's sort of part of the editorial on it. He has all the features on all of these great designers like Simon Unglis, who worked very closely with Lee McQueen. Um, Before Wednesday, Kevin and I met because Kevin had a publication called Lemon, and he contacted me because he was really interested in working with David. He Lemon, each issue was a specialized issue. It was focused on one artist or one creative. They did a Kubrick issue, they did a Michael Jackson issue, and they did a Bowie issue.
Yeah.
I don't know if
I
you've
believe it or not, I own that.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
Daft Punk did the front and back cover.
Yeah.
And, immediately, that's Heroes. I mean, that is
Yes.
such an iconic thing. And throughout it, there are all of these, sort of great elements. This was during the period when he wasn't doing any press,
Yeah.
late 2000s. And he agreed to do an interview for Lemon. And so Kevin and I are great friends, and we have been ever since. So I think this came out in if it came out in like 2009, maybe. It takes a long time to put these together.
Can I
But
tell you, I purchased that when it came out and I didn't get it.
oh, you did?
No, I mean I got part of it, but I think there was a lot that went. I think I would understand it better today, but there was a lot at the time that went over my head.
Yeah, it's very esoteric. I mean, I
Yeah.
think Kevin's a designer that goes really deeply into the subject matters and does get very esoteric. But
Yeah.
I think Bowie did that too. He would
Oh, of course.
have
Yeah.
all of these references that at the time you don't necessarily know.
Yes.
And then over time you kind of get it. And you're like,
Yeah.
oh, right, that's what that was about, or that's where that came from. I think Bowie was a great teacher in that way. So many elements for me personally. I learned about William Burroughs and the Beat Generation
Hmm.
through Bowie. I learned about I was the only boy in my school who was part of the contemporary dance group. Right, I was teased mercilessly for this. No, there were two of us. There was myself and Mike Mayos, who actually was a really good dancer. I was terrible, but I had all the gear, so I sort of looked the part. But that came through, I kind of, loving Bowie and him talking about mime and Lindsay Kemp and all this kind of stuff, the Ballet Rambert and, London Contemporary Dance Company. And I thought, oh, I'm going to have a go at that, and I was like a, little 13, 14-year-old kid. And I was unafraid to do that because of Bowie leading the way with the signpost saying, oh, you should check this out.
Yeah.
And I think that was a brilliant thing about him as an artist. And all great artists do that. They kind of lead you somewhere. And they leave the breadcrumbs for you to find. They don't make
Right.
it too obvious,
It
because it,
goes back to the idea that he gave us something to do.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and still is.
Yes. So I want to go back to some of the songs on this album, and I'll tell you the one that if you were to ask me which one did I like the most, I would say Icarus Falls.
Oh,
I just
great.
like the way it sounded, and I will say it did. It's another song that has science fiction references. There's a reference to Astro Boy and Cosmic Girl, and I thought of the line from the Tin Machine song "Goodbye, Mr. Ed." Icarus takes his pratfall,
Oh,
and
I yeah.
I was wondering if that was deliberate or not, and I take from
No,
your
it
reaction
wasn't
it
that.
wasn't. But there's another line that has to have been deliberate. There's a reference to White Stains, which
Oh, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
Bowie reference in Station to Station, and that's
yeah,
an Aleister Crowley
yeah.
poem, I
Well,
think.
it's a book. It's a book.
Yeah,
It's a lyric in a poem, and it's also the title of a book.
yeah,
So, uh, in 2022, I was walking. I was in London. I was doing an event in London for like a week, and on my day off, I was walking down Charing Cross Road, and there were a couple of rare bookstores. It was actually Friday the 13th. I walked past one of the rare bookstores, and in the window was a copy of White Stains, Aleister Crowley. And I thought, if I'm going to buy that book, today's the day, Friday the
yeah,
13th, right? So I went
yeah.
in. It was an extortionate amount of money, but I bought it, and it's a title that I wouldn't have dared use like 20 or 30 years ago because it was just too close to, station to station at that time. But when it came to writing this song, I thought, I'd literally just bought the book about 3 months before, and I thought
Yeah.
I'm gonna throw it in there. It doesn't matter if people look at it and say, "Oh, that's a Bowie, steal." Fine, you got me. Like, hands up. But I've always been a fan of Crowley because I think he was a brilliant PR marketing genius. And I don't actually think he was like the great beast at all. I think he was just a kind of party animal. I think he was kind of interesting, not necessarily the greatest poet or writer, but what he did was, it was sort of, I mean, today he was kind of like I mean, I hate even saying this person's name, but he was kind of like a Donald Trump at the time. He was like this magician who fooled all these people into believing what he was doing,
Yeah.
when clearly he was in many ways just like a total charlatan, but entertaining.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that about the aforementioned, but I'm saying it about Aleister Crowley. I think
Yeah.
he was sort of harmless in a way.
So we should probably explain who he was, right?
Yeah,
So
sure.
yeah, so he was thought of as an occultist and a he uh what inspired a lot of 60s and 70s rock musicians, including Bowie, who mentions him in the song Quicksand, and Ozzy
Yeah.
Osbourne did a song about him, and he's on the cover of Sergeant Pepper's. What else do you want to say about Aleister Crowley?
Jimmy Page bought
Jimmy
his house.
Page, yeah.
Jimmy Page bought his house and then sent Paul Reeves, who was Paul is an amazing uh, expert on antiquities,
Yeah.
and was actually Jimmy's roommate I think pre Led Zeppelin, and had used to have this amazing store called Alcasura on the King's Road, which dressed everyone. He was a fashion designer before he was a dealer in antiquities, and Jimmy sent Paul off to kind of rebuy all of the original furniture that had been in Crowley's house and refixture it. So it was exactly, I mean, talk about deep research, like that's
Yeah.
kind of amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Crowley was, I mean, I don't speak as if I'm an expert on Crowley at all, but he was the founder of the Temple of the Golden Dawn or whatever it's called. He was called the wickedest man in England or whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
666, the number of the beast. I mean, it's very, in a way, cheesy when you associate it with Ozzy Osbourne, but not so cheesy when you associate it with either Bowie or with Jimmy Page, who kind of, I think, did a lot more serious research and sort of maybe understood it in a more deeper way. Yeah, so I'm not advocating for. He was somewhat of a kind of Satanist as well, which I'm not. I'm not a believer in any of
yeah,
it.
yeah.
So it's whether you're a religious person or a Satanist, it's just not my thing. But as Crowley as a kind of personality, I do find really inspiring, and his writing is kind of interesting. And I think that's what you can be as a creative person. Ultimately, if you're interesting, I think that that really counts for something. The idea of I mean, I've been lucky in my creative life. I've done things that have been very commercially and financially successful, and I've
Hmm.
done things that have been an absolute failure and haven't resonated at all. But I
Yeah,
find both of those things equally interesting, and I think that if you can be interesting, that's to other people. If it's one person, it doesn't matter if it's one person or a million people. If that's interesting to someone else, great. We're as I say this a lot to students, as kids, we're all creative. We all draw, we all paint, we finger paint, we come up with ideas, we live in our heads. And then somewhere along the way, with many people, somebody tells them, oh, you need to get serious. You've got to put away all those childlike things. And I think it's really sad. I think that's one of the difficult things about our societal norms as they're sort of perceived, that we should all be creatively expressing ourselves. I think it's a great therapeutic endeavor. And good and bad doesn't really matter. It's just like having that output is very key for human existence. And it's why things like music and art and fashion and all of these creative pursuits, they actually do matter in
yeah.
society. So I think it's really important for us all to really remember that. And David was very much about that. And I think that's why he was afraid to try all these, unafraid to try all these things, and didn't care whether he failed or whether, he might look foolish or whatever. You mentioned Tin Machine. He was sort of derided for that at the time. But if you listen to those records, they're actually a lot of the songs are great songs, and the
Yeah.
performances are incredible. What a great the Sales Brothers and Reeds, great band. So I think that that's a big lesson to learn from Bowie is express yourself.
So I didn't mean to get on a tangent, but I do want to ask you this because of what you're saying. There's a line between being true to yourself artistically and the role of the art as interactive.
Yeah.
It's not art. I mean, maybe it is, but it's not art if you make it and nobody sees it and reacts to it. So being unafraid to fail still means being willing to put your art out there. So what is that line and how do you avoid crossing over into, I think what's commonly called selling out, but also producing art that is meant to be consumed, that's meant to be a way of communicating with other people.
It's a great question. I mean, it's also context is a big part of art, right?
Yeah.
So, a spin art painting, if you go to Coney Island during the summer and there's a stall that's letting you do spin art paintings, and you pay your $20 and you come away with a spin art painting and you hang it on your wall at home, and your family say, oh, that's nice. But if you're Damien Hirst and you do that and you hang it in the Tate Gallery, people say, I want to pay millions of pounds for that. It's the
Yeah.
same thing, right? But it's context.
Yes.
And I think that's part of the nature of art. If you look at, I mean, the obvious example is Van Gogh, right? The guy sold one painting in his lifetime. He was probably dying to sell out.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
loved to have sold out. Little did he know Sunflowers was going to sell for millions and millions of dollars years later.
Couldn't imagine.
And if he had known that, would it have had a detrimental effect on his art? His striving, his trying, his where he was in his own mind about his creativity. Would it have changed that? I don't know.
Yeah,
Um, but I think, it's very much about context and about the time in which you create something.
yeah. So I want to go back to the album and ask you about two more songs, and there's more than two more songs on the album. In fact, there's one called Coney Island. You just mentioned Coney Island.
I did.
But yeah. So I want to ask you about these two because to me anyway, I hear other influences in these two songs. And the one you've already mentioned, which is Lady Bump Discotheque, which really reminded me of Roxy Music. And
Oh,
I
great.
think, yeah, and specifically the song 2HB,
Oh,
uh,
right. That's a
which is,
big compliment.
yeah, well, no, I just, I heard the echo, and there's a reference in the lyrical reference to Casablanca, A Kiss Is Not a Kiss, in the song,
That's
which made
true.
me think
Yeah.
of, yeah. And then it also, you mentioned Ava Cherry's on it, and there's a line that references white light and white lines, which to me, goes back to the Velvet Underground, White Light, White Heat, which Bowie covered, and then obviously the White Lines reference. Everybody knows what that means.
Yep. Yeah.
But so can you talk? I mean, you talked a little bit about doing it with Ava and the
Yeah.
origin of the idea. I really like in fact, the club behind me was I designed that, obviously using AI, but with that song in mind, like
Sure.
where I'm imagining this like British town, this English town club, sort of like Saturday Night Fever, but British. It's like the Brooklyn Club, not the Manhattan Club.
Yeah.
That's what I had in mind. That's what this song
Yeah.
evoked from me. But tell me more about what some of your influences were.
Well, it was very much that. So growing up, I grew up in a town called Doncaster, which
Yeah,
is about 25, 30 miles from Sheffield, 40 miles from Leeds. It's a small town that all the trains pass through on the way to somewhere else.
yeah,
Uh, when we were growing up, there were two or three nightclubs in the town. There was a big club called Rotters, which is a great name, uh, which was very, very commercial. And literally, there would be a line outside of guys with. There was a very famous soccer player called Kevin Keegan who had kind of a permed mullet and I think a mustache. Maybe he didn't have a mustache, but all of the guys that used to line up outside this club had that haircut and a mustache and a fabric called boucle, which is kind of like little loops of fabric in a sort of wine color. So it was called a box jacket. So very square shoulders, with a skinny tie. But this was kind of like not cool. This was like after it had been cool.
yeah, yeah,
And then all the girls were in the most incredibly short skirts with like their legs were always blue because Doncaster is cold. The north of England's cold. So you'd see a line of all these people, mostly drunk already, very, very inebriated. And they were young. They were like probably, 18, 19, 20 years old. Because they were drunk, the guys were somewhat, aggressive
yeah,
uh, and loud. And so if you were not into that scene, you kind of weren't welcome there. So the other place to go to was a club called the Time and Place. And that was sort of like a smaller version of the same kind of thing. And when you're talking about the nightclub in Brooklyn, this is like several steps down several rungs down the ladder from that.
yeah,
It
yeah,
didn't have the little like floor that lit up. They had a few lights. They had a DJ, and so it was very, very difficult to find somewhere to go out as a young person without getting beaten up. If you wore anything that wasn't, the permed mullet and all the rest of the accoutrement, you kind of get attacked, you know. So we always had a hard time getting in, sneaking into places, and then trying to go unnoticed. So that lyric from Lady Bump Discotheque was really referencing that whole period.
Yeah, yeah.
The white lines, white light, white lines lyric isn't actually a reference to white light, white heat, although it could
Oh,
be.
okay.
I
Yeah,
mean, it might have been very
yeah,
subconsciously, but that wasn't intentional. It was really about every club had a strobe at that time. There was no sort of thinking about anybody that might have seizures induced by flashing
mm,
lights or anything.
yeah,
So every club had a strobe, you know. And so that was where the white lights were, and obviously the white lines. I don't think there were any drugs of that type. Doncaster was actually quite rough at one point with the drug culture. But I don't know about that point. We were young teenagers anyway, so we wouldn't really see that. But you
yeah,
could, as a 14-year-old, you could sneak into a nightclub. They'd let you in, which wouldn't happen today, and probably is a good thing for safety reasons. But at that time, you could kind of sneak in. So that was me referencing that whole period,
yeah,
and we were dressed like punks, but we were listening to Donna Summer and Chic and
yeah,
other and also terrible disco as well. I mean, I kind of think of Donna Summer and Chic as being the creme de la creme of that musical soundtrack. But there was also a lot of like really terrible second rate stuff too. But yeah, it's really referencing that whole moment. And one of my closest friends to this day is a woman called Yvonne Taylor, who was a couple of years older than me. So she kind of done all of this before I had. So she was kind of showing me the way. And her boyfriend at the time was later joined a band that I was in, a new romantic band that I was in. And again, he was a few years older. So they were both together and separately big influences on me because they were kind of like older brother sister who were showing me the way. They'd been to London, they'd been to the Blitz, they had all the clothes from PX and Vivienne Westwood. They bought the Anthony Price. I know Yvonne had an Anthony Price dress, and they were working, so they probably had the means to do that. They were a massive influence on me. And probably I wouldn't have even had the foresight to think about going to art college or doing any of that without meeting those people at that
yeah.
time. That was a very seminal thing. So this is sort of, referencing that whole moment.
Yeah, the other thing that it evoked for me, I grew up in Buffalo, New York, which sounds to me like the same type of town that you grew up in. Um, and my mother was a high school teacher, and so she would sometimes, as part of her job, be a kind of a chaperone for school events during the disco period when I was a child, and she would take me. And I remember I had these fuzzy memories of being a young child disco dancing with the high school students, but it's the same type of setting, right? It's not Studio 54. It's
Yeah, yeah,
literally Casa de Pizza, it's like so, but there's that same feeling in the mullets, right? I mean, that's
yep.
also like I think in Buffalo people still wear mullets. So it's but yeah,
They've come back again a few times since then,
yeah, yeah.
ironically and seriously as well. So,
So I want to ask you about one other song,
yep.
which is evokes in me a different reference, which is the song English Country Garden,
Oh
which
yeah,
yeah, it sounds to me it makes me think of Oasis, and
yeah. It's
way in
very
the
Britpop.
yeah, yeah. So that's all. It's from a different era, right? It has a resonance of not from the new romantic period, but from
Sure.
something a little more contemporary.
Yeah, it's literally from a different era because I wrote that song in the 90s.
Ah,
I think
yeah,
97, 98, maybe. And it was a demo that I had a couple of different versions of. And I played it to Fabio. The way Fabio and I work is we write together, we write separately, we throw stuff together, we share ideas. Whatever is the best idea, we go with. And however it plays out, we go with that. So I might have he might come to me with a complete song that needs lyrics and a vocal, and I'll do that. I may come to him with a demo where everything's done, vocal, music, everything, but the chorus isn't strong enough, and he'll rewrite the chorus, or he
Yeah.
may rewrite all the backing, you know. So we just go with whatever. There's no ego. It's like whatever is the best outcome. And you know, to his credit, I played in this track, and he said, and it's similar to Euphoria, which is another track that is on this album.
Yes. Yeah.
David Torn is playing on. Fabio came to me with Euphoria, written completely, lyrics and everything. And he said to me, "Oh, if you want, you could change the lyrics." But, you know, being Italian, he was sort of less confident about writing English lyrics. And I said, "No, it's great. Let's go with it. You know, why not go with it?" Often singers want to write their lyrics, but they never question doing a cover of someone else's song. So I
Yeah.
kind of look at it in that way, like you brought a song, it's like we're doing a cover of it. So let's leave it as it is. It's great. So with English Country Garden, it was the same idea, and it definitely has that Oasis vibe. It has that, you know, the descending chords, the Beatles
Yeah. Yeah.
descending chords, which is also kind of a bit all the young dudes. You know, it's that
Yes. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
those references are definitely there as well. Yeah, so and we just love doing an interpretation of it, and I think the original version of that is on our album King Boy Vandals,
Hmm.
and we had Richard Fortis, who's a friend of mine from way back. He plays in Guns N' Roses and has done for about 20, maybe more than 20 years now. And so he played guitar, lead guitar on that, played solo on the original electric version of it. But this is the stripped down kind of acoustic take.
Yeah.
So it was good fun to do that. And you know, and also with Ziggy, we did a cover of Ziggy,
Yes.
you
Yes.
know, which again is just totally stripped down. It's just guitar and voice, and you know, it's a bit audacious doing such an iconic song. And I tried to do the vocal. There's definitely an influence of the Bauhaus version in
Yeah.
there.
I thought that. Yeah.
Yeah, because you know, I was and remain a big Bauhaus fan. I know Pete Murphy, David J. They stayed with us in New York as well. You know, so there's definitely a little bit of that in there. It's not really a take on the original Ziggy Stardust. It's kind of like a multi-influenced version. So
Yeah. I wasn't going to ask you about Ziggy Stardust because um, we could have a whole show just about Ziggy Stardust, but it's also, you know, I will point out that obviously it's of a piece of the other sort of space songs, right? So
yeah,
it's very
yeah, yeah.
much belongs on the album, and it's a terrific rendition. And I
Thank
will
you.
also say, I wasn't going to ask you about Euphoria, but I will say this. So I'm saying this not to you, but to David Torn, because you told me that he played on the album, but you either didn't tell me what song he played on, or no, you didn't. So in my notes, next to Euphoria, I like David Torn question mark. So I was like, David, I recognize your
Was
playing.
Yeah.
So
And again with David, I kind of messaged David Torn out of the blue.
yeah,
You know, and we had this track, and his playing is so experimental.
yeah,
And that track I felt needed that counterpoint. You know, the instrumentation on it is very much as you would expect. And so I kind of wanted something a bit more offbeat, and it's not really dissonant because he is very melodic, but he doesn't play. He kind of plays a counterpoint. And I loved what he did with, you know, on Heathen and on other
right.
Bowie
Yeah,
records. And also he worked with David Sylvian, who's another artist that I really love. He worked with Mick Karn on the Polytown record as well in the 90s. So Mick Karn, former bass player, sadly departed from Japan. So you know, David Torn, I've always loved his playing, and you know, and he very graciously was willing to play on this. So we kept it for the acoustic version. We kind of like folded it back in again, and I think it works really well. You know, it's just Fabio's acoustic and
yeah, yeah,
experimental electric, and you know, a bit of vocal on there, and it's a done deal.
yeah. It's beautiful. It really is. So if you're watching this, you get a sense of what this album is about, and you know if you part of the reason I'm referencing the influences is because I think if you like David Bowie or Oasis or Roxy Music or David Torn or Mike Garson, you're gonna like this album. So Keenan, let me ask you this: where can people find it?
So the last two records that we did, obviously with this little fella, which is again like beautifully designed, um, red vinyl, the whole thing, and also King Boy Vandals came out on vinyl and on CD too. With the acoustic record, we're just doing a digital release. It's going to be streamed on all streaming
Hmm.
platforms. Um, and so you can check it out on Spotify, on YouTube, on all of the whatever streaming platform you use, you'll be able to find it there. So yeah, please give it a listen, and
Yeah.
I hope you enjoy it as much as we enjoy putting it together.
Yeah.
And yeah, so thank you for listening. We always appreciate it, and if anybody wants any of the other releases, you can DM me. I can send you stuff. We've got vinyls, and one thing I only have one copy of, unfortunately. So I did manage to get my name on a Bowie record, which this came out with the fashion collection at Target, and it was a CD of I think there's six unreleased tracks. There's Gene Genie, Strangers When We Meet, Pretty Things, Word on a Wing, Crashing the Same Car, and Young Americans. The obviously with the Slinky Vagabond lyric in there. I only have this copy of this, and I rarely see it. I don't ever see it being sold on social media. I know it was sold in several thousand copies with the clothes, but I think it became a bit of a collector's item after that. So yeah,
I do not own a copy, so
yeah.
if
Don't
you
don't ask me for that because I only have one.
But well, let me ask you this because I wasn't expecting you to bust that out. When you say they're unreleased tracks, are they live versions? Are they
Yeah,
alternate studio mixes, or what are they?
yeah. So Gene Genie's live from Santa Monica, so that was obviously released. Strangers When We Meet was a Buddha of Suburbia
Hmm.
version. Um, Pretty Things is the Hunky Dory Collector's Edition. Word on a Wing was live Nassau at 76, which at the time hadn't been
Yeah,
released in that
yeah,
thing. Always Crashing the Same Car was from the Low Collector's Edition. And Young Americans is a live version from Glass Spider, which at the time some of these weren't released. So
yeah,
we kind of David chose the tracks, and it was I think quite nicely put together by the EMI team at the time. And like I said, not as a musician, but I got my name on a Bowie album, which
yeah. That's great.
was kind of like a lifetime dream come true. Yeah, so that's the music and the fashion for me always cross over in some weird way, whether I want it to or not. It always
Yeah.
happens. So it's
Well,
obviously my destiny.
Keenan, like as we're drawing this interview to a close, I feel like there's so much more to discuss, and I'm hoping you'll join me again in the future.
Anytime, anytime. If people want to listen, anytime. I appreciate the time and I appreciate your generosity and for anybody that listens, thank you.
Yeah, well, this has been terrific, and the album is wonderful, and I'm looking forward to its release. Keenan gave me an advance copy, and I'm looking for I'll link to it once it's on YouTube as well. So
Fantastic.
wonderful, Keenan Duffty. Thank you very very much.
Thanks, everyone.